Hello and welcome to Oscar Mike Radio, a special edition. Uh, I love getting to do these and the flexibility to be able to have special shows, special editions for things that we have going on and instances and initiatives and topics that can't wait for a normal show. Oscar Mike Radio is co-produced by System One Productions. What's your podcast doing? My guest with me for this time is an old friend I've known for quite some time in the podcasting world, but also in the military world. Uh, I have enjoyed his perspective because he is a colonel retired in the U.S. Army from the Judge Advocate General Corps. Colonel Resnick, Robert Resnick, welcome to Oscar Mike Radio. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks. It's great to be with you. I love your show. I love what you do for veterans and the military community, and it's an honor to be here and talk about some important stuff with you tonight.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, and really appreciate that. And the important stuff is, you and I have seen the terrible disaster in New Orleans. I joined the Marine Corps from Shreveport, Louisiana, so it kind of hit close to home. And then the Cybertruck exploding in Las Vegas, and there's been a lot of back and forth about what actually happened, who's at fault, who's to blame, so on and so forth. And I want to start by saying that, on behalf of myself, Colonel Resnick, Oscar Mike Radio, Sinister One Productions, Hoobazoo, our hearts go out to those who were impacted by this terrible event. And the fact that it was done by veterans in active duty military really hits close to home with us. Our thoughts and prayers are with you all. And that's the thing, sir. A lot of back and forth has been going on about this. What actually happened? Who's really at fault? What's the root cause analysis? And I've kind of held back trying to opine because I don't have all the facts yet. But still, what we are talking about is the aspect that PTSD in both these people's lives played in us getting to this point. And I value your perspective. I value, your experience. And I'm sure you've had to deal with PTSD related incidents in the JAG Corps. The very first thing I want to talk about is this PTSD thing has been a thing for almost 15 years now. And a ton of money, resources, time, effort has been put into it. And people are starting to ask me, are we making any progress? When's it end? And if we're doing so much good for PTSD, why are we having these problems? And I think the root question, though, is, sir, what actually is the problem that led us to this point?
It's interesting. Let me. I want to address your question, but let
Sure.
me take 5 seconds.
Absolutely.
Because you mentioned the two incidents that are on people's minds, obviously New Orleans and the Las Vegas incidents. I look at them as entirely different, unrelated incidents.
Okay.
And so when we talk about, obviously that's my opinion. It doesn't have to be yours or anybody else's. But when we talk about those in more specificity as we go further, I can draw the distinction. But, one was clearly an act of terrorism, addressed at United States policy and other, related issues. Another one was more the frustrated actions of a person suffering, but not necessarily an act of terrorism. So we'll look at those and the role that PTSD may have played in one or the other. We know it did in the Las Vegas incident. It may have to some extent in the other one, but less so. But we'll see. But let me address where you wanted to start, which was the fact is, what are we doing about this? Well, PTS, post-traumatic stress, and it changes names. It was post-traumatic stress disorder. Now it's post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSS. I just call it PTS, but again, people can use what they're comfortable with. It's morphed over the years, but it really goes back to the same thing. We've known about it going back to certainly, the 20th century, the World War II for sure, Vietnam for sure, and even before that, right? As medicine improves, psychiatric medicine improves, our knowledge improves, and so we know more about it. And here's something that I'm going to share. You may have heard this before. I listened to your show, but I don't know everything that you talk about. I don't know if this has come up before. But before the 2003 invasion, going into that preparation, the Pentagon did some psychiatric studies. So the important thing to start with is that this isn't something that just, goes ignored, that it's just, oh, PTS is out there. Some people get it, some people, whatever. No, the Pentagon actually actively brings in groups of distinguished academics, professionals, treaters, all types, to work in conferences and do workshops and to try to understand this. Now, that doesn't always lead to an immediate result, right? We know it takes a while. But nevertheless, they do that. And so some of the things that we knew in the 2000s was the fact that just about everyone who experiences a combat environment, by the way, post-traumatic stress is not a military thing. You can get post-traumatic stress from something that happens in early childhood, from a car accident, from seeing something horrific. You can get PTS from a number of things. Everybody is different. But in a military sense, obviously, people who experience the combat environment, whether you fire your weapon, whether you see somebody injured or dead, that obviously could exacerbate it. But just being in the environment, the stress, the everyday stress, and I know you know that as a veteran. I know that the people I served with experienced it. People at home, I think, can have a sense of it if they haven't served, especially if they have friends and relatives who did. But it's the kind of thing that everybody experiences it a little bit differently. And so some of the important lessons that we learned was that everyone who experiences that type of environment, that ongoing extended stress period, experiences post-traumatic stress. Not everybody manifests it. Not everybody needs medication. Not everybody needs therapy. Not everybody displays evidence that people would say, oh, that person must have post-traumatic stress. Some people will go there the rest of their life without ever manifesting symptoms, but everybody experiences something from being in that environment, the combat environment, the stress environment. And so, you don't know because it's in our DNA, it's in our genetics, how we're all wired differently. Some of us get angry quickly. Some of us are very patient. Some of us are frustrated. Some, again, everybody's different. And so some people, and you can't predict who, will have a very minor, relatively speaking, minor experience and come back with more significant PTS. Other people might have multiple deployments, be involved in heavy combat in each of them, and come back relatively, to other people anyway, unscathed. And so there's a whole range and an extreme. And what this Pentagon study talked about in the early 2000s, before we went to Iraq and Afghanistan, or certainly before we went to Iraq, was number one, that everybody gets something and that we don't always know. And secondly, they talked about what would be the sweet spot as far as the duration of the combat experience. And they had said 6 months. 6 months is the sweet spot. More than 6 months, you risk more people with more serious PTS or other related conditions. Obviously, 6 months or less, you could get it from a day, you can get it from a single experience, but statistically speaking, 6 months was the sweet spot.
So
Now, that's
if
not feasible logistically.
So if you serve in a combat zone from 6 months or more, you're more liable to get it if you're
Yes.
okay.
The studies show that the longer you go, it's not like an even graph that goes up like that.
For
But
sure.
the longer you're there, the more likely you're going to experience something and the more severe it might be. And so the problem is our logistics don't marry up to that, right? I think from your experience and your knowledge, that it's very expensive to move units in and out of theater, especially if you're going across the world. It's one thing if you're taking a bus 2 hours. Obviously, we're taking large numbers of individuals by aircraft. We're shipping as well as flying, loads of equipment and everything. It's very expensive to get units in and out of theater. And so logistically, and I'm not saying that anybody put a price tag on this. I'm not. It's two related issues. One is the PTS, the other one is the logistics. And it was just too difficult from a resource, money, time, all of that, to do 6-month rotations. In World War II, what you had was, because so many people were in theater, they would kind of do a leapfrog, right? A unit would be in contact with the enemy, but then another unit who was behind them would go forward and take over the lead. And then another unit would leapfrog them to take the lead. And so, as this leapfrog is going, you're eventually going back to the rear area. So you're not flying in and out of theater. You're not in a safe environment, but you would be moved out of the main combat operation. So even in World War II, we understood some of this. But because we had more forces in theater, at least in Europe, we were able to do that. in Iraq, in Afghanistan, because obviously the nature of warfare changed. Our national leadership was not interested in mobilizing more people, because you would lose public support. The more people you mobilize, the higher the casualties, everything else. And so what happened was they did 12-month rotations, because that was more supportable logistically. And it makes sense, right? When you look at the logistics, 12 months is much easier to do. You can serve twice as long. And then when the surge happened, everybody said the surge was such a brilliant thing. And tactically, the troops were successful. We have brilliant troops in the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Navy, Coasties, everybody, Space Force now. We have well-trained, well-led, great troops who accomplish whatever they're asked to do. And so even in the surge, which was 18 months or more, and I see somebody in the chat said 25 months, that's an incredible amount of time. Thank you for your service, and feel free to share your experience with that. 25 months is incredibly excessive from a psychological point of view. I'm assuming those were consecutive. But anyway, so the point is that the issue is that the surge with 18 months in a combat environment without rotating out caused a lot more PTS than what should have done. And that wasn't done with malice. It was just, that was what was decided. I'm sure it was a very complicated, difficult decision that the leadership in the Pentagon was making, with all kinds of input from politics to military to everything else. But that's the reality. And so you have people who've come home with this. And so the question then becomes, what do we do? And so I do see improvement over the years, multiple administrations, with the VA, right? The VA had a very bad reputation, and deservedly so. And people said, hey, what are we doing here? We're sending people to war, especially with Iraq and Afghanistan, 20 years in Afghanistan. We had a lot of people coming back with physical, mental, all kinds of issues. And so the VA, and I'm a VA patient. I have no problem sharing that. I use VA care. I get great care, and it's not by rank, by the way. They don't recognize rank in the VA. I don't get anything because I'm a colonel or a retired colonel. They call me Veteran Resnick. That's what you're addressed at in the VA facility, not by your rank. I love that, because everybody is there based on their needs. And so I go in there just a veteran like everybody else, and I get great care. And the wait times are dramatically reduced, and the level of care is pretty good. I don't need anything significant. I'm not putting myself in that level. I'm just saying that we've done a good job on the VA side, and they always are asking, how are you feeling? And they're making available, the emotional, psychological counseling side. And so, you could make it available. The question is, are people going to accept? And so, when we talk about the number of veterans who commit suicide every day, different things like that, yes, it gets a lot of attention. The question is, how do you break through to people? There are people who they don't realize that they need help, maybe. And so, that's where we can still use improvement from the buddy system, from the command side. Families need to be aware, and we get that, right? People come home and they get all this information, but you don't necessarily process it all at the same time. So I think that's the starting point.
But here's another thing, sir, like with the situation in Las Vegas, like when I was in, and I'm sure you saw this too, like we would come to, work. It wasn't work, but it was work on Monday morning. And by Tuesday, we'd get an idea if a guy was having a problem or not.
Yeah.
And you might not know what the problem is, but okay, Johnson is not firing on all cylinders. And it's not like he was hungover or got in a fight with his girlfriend, like something really bad happened. And by like Friday, it's like, okay, they're sir, something's going on here. Or not, sir, you go your corporal or sergeant first in our line of work. But we all knew who was having the problems, who was doing great in life, who was having wife problems, or who was having we knew that. So it's just, sometimes it's hard for me to understand how these people act without nobody knowing what's going on with them. Does that make any sense?
It does. And, again, you have all kinds of leaders, good, bad, in the middle, and different types of organizations and what have you. And again, that's why we count on the fact that the buddy system has to stand up too, that sometimes people have to you're not ratting out your friend. You're getting your friend help. You're saving your friend's life by taking an issue forward. As a leader, I was a major when I was in Iraq, and I served all the way to colonel. So I led some pretty large organizations post deployment when I knew what to experience and when I knew what other people had experienced because of my own time. Everybody is different, but you get a sense of it. I had people working for me, soldiers who worked for me, that were clearly experiencing PTS in a significant way. And when you have it in an obvious way, then you get them help. You sit down and you figure out what's the best way to get this person where they need to be. And most of the time, if you would have just a reasonable conversation with them coming from a good place, they would listen, they would go get evaluated and what have you, and you could save people. And that included, not just going to therapy, but maybe inpatient, right? That's part of the care that we've improved in the years since these wars began. And so, you could get somebody to inpatient that can work. The challenge that you have is when people are, as we call it, self-medicating, when they're going home and drinking excessively, using narcotics, becoming addicted to pain medication, things like that. The opioid crisis is very much connected to this. Then sometimes people don't see that. If they have a family, does the family come forward and ask for help? I had that happen. I had a soldier that was going home and, not committing domestic violence per se, but was experiencing problems where the family came forward and said, it was the wife who came in, my husband needs help. And so you need to do that because they trusted that we weren't going to just put their name on a list and kick them out. We got them help. And so you've got to build trust with the families and the individuals so that they come to you, and however they come on your radar, they're willing to trust you that you have their best interest. I unfortunately had a soldier, and it was an officer who tried to kill herself. Obviously, I won't use any names or share any description, but I got one of those dreaded calls in the middle of the night from the hospital that one of my people was brought in after an attempted suicide. She was saved. They saved her. It may have been more of a gesture than a real attempt, but it could have gone bad if somebody hadn't gotten her help. And the next day, I got another call saying, "You're the only person she's willing to talk to." And so I went down. I would have gone anyway, but I got that call. I went down there, and her only concern was, "Is this going to end my career?" That's all she cared about. Is this going to end my career? And I looked her straight in the eyes. I said, "Not if I have anything to do with it." I said, "I'm thrilled that you're here. I'm thrilled that you're willing to speak to me. I assume you're speaking to your treatment, providers. Do what they tell you to do. Talk about things. You get yourself better, and we'll worry about the rest later. You have nothing to worry about right now." Just, and she did. She made a full rebound, and to my knowledge, continued to serve. I don't know for how long, but that's what it takes, right? And so that could have gone horribly wrong had she not been discovered in time, or if she hadn't gotten the treatment that she needed. So if you're a leader of people, it doesn't matter what branch, doesn't matter what service, you're going to experience this. And we all, you could go through training, but you never think it's going to be real. You just have to have the gut instinct and focus on people. That's all it is people. The Marine Corps is people. The Army is people, right? We're people. And if our people are good, then we perform great. If our people are suffering, we can't do the mission no matter what. And so that's what it's about. And it falls on the shoulders of leaders. And I'm not touting myself. I wasn't perfect, but you do what you have to do. And if leaders step up and build trust and make sure that they're taking care of their units, then we can address this problem. We can improve the situation.
One of the parallels to a lot of what you're saying applies to people. A lot of veterans go into law enforcement, first responder work, as firefighters or EMTs, and they get a different dose of it there.
That's
Because
right.
for a lot of them, and even those civilian ones who never served in the military who are in law enforcement, for example, I didn't really realize till I started peeling back the numbers that they see trauma every day. Whereas for a lot of us in the military, it's a lot of waiting around and then intense periods of actions. They might see, chaos, death, and destruction every day, multiple times. So it wears on them. But you brought up something where a lot of them, veterans too, will not get help because of the aspect that the minute they say, "Hey, I need help," give me your gun, give me your badge, you're out of here, or you're behind a desk and you're radioactive. No one wants to work with you, and you're not considered trustworthy. And the reason I bring that up is there's a lot of parallels in advocating for law enforcement, first responders, as it is for veterans. And looking at that, how can we support those people as well? Because I believe if we can help our first responders and firefighters and EMTs and nurses, we're going to have benefits to our military population, sir.
It's the same thing. You're absolutely right, Travis. They experience all kinds of trauma. Think about police and fire and EMT that show up at a horrific car crash and see, the type of stuff that people joke about in driver's ed videos, except it's real, right? There's nothing funny. And they don't think it's funny, of course, but they see that, and they see it a lot. And so the PTS situation in all first responders is very, very real. And again, individuals like everybody else, some people can see all kinds of stuff and they don't apparently react much to it. Some people can see very little and react very heavily to it. The issue is this, and it's interesting that you ask about that. What I'm doing now is part of what I do is I teach the police academy programs up here. And so I'm talking to people who are going to be future law enforcement officers. They're
Okay.
going through academy training, and I do part of their instruction. And we talk about PTS. I include it in my criminal justice classes with them. When I talk about the sort of introduction to law enforcement, introduction to criminal justice, those type of classes. Towards the end of the semester, I show them some video. There's an excellent Frontline program. They do a lot of criminal justice on the show Frontline on PBS. And one of them, they did something on law enforcement PTS, and I showed that video. And it's emotional, right? Because you're seeing officers who talk about some of the things that they've seen, whether it's their fellow officers being shot dead right next to them, or horrific car crashes, or all the stuff that we can imagine that they see. And they talk about how it affects them. And they talk about how they didn't know to get help, and they started either drinking or committing domestic violence or getting themselves in trouble. And it took a crisis. It took a crisis to get help. And it's the same thing. Military, law enforcement, fire, it's the same idea. You got to get help. You've got to recognize it, or somebody has to recognize it in you and help you get help. And because, look, it's not something that goes away, but with the right treatment, you can be completely normal. You can get rid of the anger, or at least minimize it. You can get rid of some of the other negative stuff going on. And that's really what it's about, so that people can live normal lives and not lose their families, because losing your family and losing your job in whatever combination is what sends people to rock bottom. And that's what was happening, what we saw in the Las Vegas, to get back on track here with the Las Vegas incident, is you had somebody whose life was falling apart. And, I'm assuming, based on the nature of the work he did, that he had PTS. I don't think we have an official diagnosis, but it's safe to assume that he had it, whether it was diagnosed or not. Now, that by itself, PTS or any other any emotional or psychiatric issue, doesn't cause people to be violent or cause people to commit crimes. But there's a correlation where some people who do commit violent acts, you can see that is where it comes from. Sometimes it's that frustration that they don't know what to do. And so what you have then is somebody like this who maybe didn't understand the nature of his problems. Maybe his unit didn't understand the nature of his problems. Maybe they did. Maybe he was getting help and it didn't work, or maybe he just didn't. We don't know those facts. As you said at the beginning of the show, we don't have all the facts. And so we have to just kind of state our assumptions up front. And so I think, when you're in a unit like that, those units are tight, And so I would think that people knew that he was struggling, but maybe not. And I'm not saying they ignored it. I'm just saying some people just reject the help. Some people hide. Some people, we don't know. What's interesting about this guy is, of course, people talk about how, they talk like a bomb, right? It wasn't a bomb. It was an incendiary device.
Yep.
His vehicle was not going to blow up like a bomb. There were not going to be projectiles. In fact, there was minimal damage to the structure. People see the fire in front of the building there. There were sprinklers there, but there, other than some charring, all it was a car fire. There was very little damage. I know a couple of people had minor injuries, but that relatively speaking, that wasn't that was more of a symbol, right? He wasn't
Yeah,
trying to destroy the hotel. He wasn't trying to kill people. It was a very interesting way. I mean, it, there's something called a psychological autopsy. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am not.
I've been part of those. Whenever you have somebody who commits suicide or where there's a question about that, in addition to the forensic, which is the criminal justice investigation, which we're all familiar with, the detectives go and they do, fingerprints and ballistics and blood and all that. There's also something called a psychological autopsy, which does have a law enforcement representative to it, a legal representative, which is the role I played in several of them. Uh, Chaplains, medical, all kinds of professionals come together, and there's no privilege. Nothing's protected. It's all out in the open. The process is protected, but the individuals there have to speak freely. And what we're trying to figure out is, what were the signs? Did we miss signs that this person was a danger to themselves? Because most of the time it's from a suicide or suicide-like situation. What did we miss here? And it's not about blaming. This doesn't lead to blaming. This leads to understanding. What are we supposed to be, what could we look for in the future? And so there's going to be a psychological autopsy on this Las Vegas case, because it was a suicide. He died from a self-inflicted
yeah.
gunshot wound in the vehicle. Now, I find that interesting because he knew that the vehicle was going to catch fire. You would think that based on, he would have died had he not shot himself. He would have died in the fire. We all saw the video. Nobody would have lived in the vehicle, but yet he wanted to kill himself first, knowing that 15 or 17 seconds later, that vehicle was going to erupt the way it did, and he would have died that way. So I find that very interesting. Like, why? And so this will be the type of thing that we study in his mannerisms and what we can learn about this. We may never get answers to all of the questions, but that to me is what's fascinating about this in a way. And I don't mean to be morbid here, but why did he shoot himself seconds before he was going to die anyway? And then the other thing is, he had no beef with Trump or anybody in the hotel. There wasn't some conference going on there. That was just a place he picked. Was it random? Was it someplace he had been to and said, I guess I'll just do it here? Why do it there? There wasn't a reason to do it there. So, we may never know. There were some writings. We saw his writings that he posted, and we know that he was angry. We know he was angry about a lot of things, some political, some otherwise, but it wasn't connected to what he chose to do. So this one is going to vex us for a while, I think.
So I want to go back a little bit. You and I talked before we went live about the Army soldier. I forget his first name. It was Resnick, who defected to North Korea, and they looked at that and they pointed to the fact that his wife cheated on him. He went to the Army for help. They didn't help him out, and when he got a chance to defect, he did. But it goes back to leadership in that regard, right? If leadership had treated him differently, what would have happened? Because it wound up, being inconsequential in some respects, but in other respects, it was a black mark on the Army for a long time because, he lived a good long life in North Korea. But it also got me thinking, before it was called shell shock after World War One, you'd have to think back in the Civil War, other wars where there was a lot of loss of life, and when you actually had to get close to somebody and kill them, how did we deal with PTSD or shell shock back then? Because it's almost like you didn't hear about this really until Vietnam. But
Right.
Korea, World War II, and World War One certainly were horrific scenes at some points. And we asked our soldiers to do horrific things. And it was kind of like glossed over, for lack of a better term.
There's no one answer to that question. It's an
Sure.
interesting thing to think about. And first of all, in some ways, advances in medical care allow more people not just to survive war, but survive being injured in battle.
Right.
We don't lose as many people because the medical care we can do, the ability to save lives further forward, is so much more improved that more people come home with injuries than before. And so a lot of the people who come home with PTS from that experience, thankfully they came home, because in previous wars they would have died, and they would have been listed as killed in action instead of wounded in action. So we didn't necessarily have the same number of people percentage wise, because more people died in combat than survived it back in those earlier wars, especially the Civil War, right? Because not just because of the scars of war, but just the sedentary, yeah, the sanitary conditions and what have you. People were dying from all
Well,
kinds of
right,
things.
right. More people died from infections and
Right,
gangrene than
right.
musket balls, which was weird.
That's right. And so you didn't have as many, like, right. And I'm just being, you know, using some colloquial here, but the crazy veteran, right? When people say, oh, the person, oh, that person was in the war, that they were in the war, leave them alone. That's the crazy veteran sitting in the corner. And so that's what happened in those earlier days, because people said, oh yeah, you went to war, you come back crazy, and you just kind of sit there. We ignored the problem. We didn't study it as much as we could have, or maybe we just have the ability to do it better now, but we just didn't pay attention to it, right? It was a family thing. The family had to do it. And if it was a really severe case, they just institutionalized people. That was the fix back then, right? We had these huge state psychiatric institutions. They
Right.
were horrific places to live, and people didn't get care there. They were just locked away so society didn't have to deal with it. And so that's where we put those people. And some of them may have been through the VA at the time, because that's all the VA was authorized to do. Some of them may have been through the state system or the federal. But we just didn't deal with it. Now, thankfully, people can come home. Thankfully, they can get treatment. Thankfully, they can get on the road to recovery and still live their lives. And so we can't just write them off the way that we used to. I'm saying we as a society,
Right, right, right.
because it's too visible now, and more people have it, and we have the ability to treat it. So it's really about education, and more than anything, it's about perseverance. It's not taking no for an answer.
So you're saying by virtue of us being able to survive combat-related injuries or even just service-related injuries, there's now a need to really look at the mental slash psychological, spiritual side of the soldier,
Yes,
of the person.
yes.
What do you think is next, sir? We've gotten to this point where there's been millions, billions of dollars thrown at this problem. There are things like CISM. Barbara checked in tonight, and Barbara's with Monkey Wrench Wellness and a civilian advocate for veterans. And CISM is critical incident stress management, amongst other things that she does. So the Mass Health Helpline, if you call that number and tell them you have a problem, a suicidal ideation or something like that, this law, they have to get you some kind of help quickly. So we have these resources, but it still seems like it's like the veteran or the person is afraid to ask for help, and we haven't
Yes.
quite crossed that barrier. What in your mind has to change for us to get to the point where it's acceptable to ask for help?
We have been trying this has been the thing we've been trying to do for 20 years now, right?
Right,
Because
right.
more than that, even because it used to be, oh no, you don't ask for help because you'll get labeled, you'll get separated, you'll get certain jobs, you'll whatever. And so there was always this negative connotation that God forbid somebody should ask for help and go get counseling, which could save their lives and make them able to do their job, only to then lose the job because they were getting counseling. In the military, we were just getting rid of people. And again, we do have better medical treatment, including psychiatric treatment, so that we have the ability to do more and to do better for people than what we used to do. But the challenge is that there are still going to be people out there that, consciously or unconsciously, refuse to do a self-analysis. They say, oh no, I can deal with it, I don't need help, or I'll tell you when I need help. I can handle this first. I'm going to try. Well, I want to handle this myself first. You have people who fool themselves into thinking their problems are minor and that they can handle it themselves by just doing whatever self-help they do. Maybe it's going fishing. Other people, it's using marijuana. I mean, there's a range of what people have done to try to get the pain to go away. And what we have to do is educate ourselves to be less willing to accept that as an answer and more willing to say, look, as your friend, I'm going to piss you off. As your brother or father or whatever, I'm going to piss you off, and I'm going to argue with you because we're going to get you some help. I'm sure you can handle this yourself, but you know what? It's not worth the risk. Let's go talk to somebody. We'll go together. We just have to do that. And as much as we've talked about that for a generation, it hasn't become normal because too many people opt out of it. And that's what we can't do. And that's why I put the burden on leaders to talk about that. Like, some of the best leaders I saw late in my career, and I say late because it was after the changes had started, when people say, hey, look, I go to counseling, folks. I'm admitting it to you all right now. I go to counseling weekly or whatever it is. And if I can do it, you can do it. Right. So,
But
some general officer or some chief of staff or somebody in a high up position says, look, I'm going to tell you, I get counseling because of something that I've experienced. And I'm here. I'm the general officer. I'm the chief of staff. I'm the whatever. If I can do it, you can do it. And that's what it takes.
But isn't totally agree with you. But isn't there an onus on the fraternal sororital side of military service where,
Yes.
hey, I'm your brother and I go to counseling, or hey, I'm your brother or sister and I notice that, hey, you're not squared away, something's going on, you know, what's going on, dude? And I'm not leaving you alone until you tell me and get up in your right. Isn't there an onus on us to look out for each other, sir?
Yes, it is. And I think, or at least I meant to start with that, because it starts with the buddy system, right?
Yes.
That buddies have to, that's what the buddy system is about. It's not somebody to have a beer with, although that's great, right? That helps,
Right.
just having a chat with somebody is helpful. That might be what most people need, is just some social, some social interaction with a good friend, or your family or whatever. That could be enough for a lot of people, but some people need more. And so the buddy system has to do that. The buddy system has to try to drag that person to their first appointment to make sure that they start it, or to go to the chain of command, or to go to the family, or go to somebody to force it. And that's what we're hesitant to do, because we're afraid of losing the friendship. But you lose the friendship if they die. You lose the friendship if they lose their life over it and wind up on the streets or wind up institutionalized. So you're not going to save the friendship, because there's not going to be a friendship there. So you might as well take the risk to help somebody. And there are people who do that. There are heroes every day across the military who are spotting problems and doing what they need to do, either walking somebody into a therapist's office, notifying the chain of command, or what have you. There are plenty of people doing that. But what we're going to hear on the news is we're going to see the exception, like what happened in Las Vegas, because that's what we see, right? Like we talked about before the show. How do we measure success? We measure success because we stop seeing it. It's going to be an invisible thing in the way that people are getting help. We don't see that. We see when they don't get help and they commit violent acts. So
Well, maybe
it's a difficult way to measure it, but that's where it starts. And so, yes, leaders have to identify it and be forceful in a positive way. Buddies have to do it. Families have to do it. If we all do it, somebody's going to pick up on these things. It won't be perfect. There will be people who fall through the cracks, because there are people who are really good at fooling people. But at the end of the day, we can help most people, and that's a good place to be.
I think we're seeing more and more veterans start shows, podcasts, live streams, so on and so forth. And I'm gonna put the call out there to anybody watching or listening to this is, hey, if you had this issue and you got through it, man, we'd certainly like to hear your story and give that hope to somebody who's on the fence about whether or not to ask for help, or be that boot in the rear to get you to help. And I think you're onto something here, sir, is maybe we need to focus more on, giving people a place to tell those stories, and praising and honoring what they do by saving those lives. Because I think you're right. Those are the real heroes. I mean, for every one in New Orleans or Las Vegas, there's probably thousands of people doing what you're saying right now. And don't look for any glory. Don't look for any recognition, but they're saving lives.
That's exactly right. And it's quiet work, and it's important work, and people aren't going to see it, but we're going to see the results.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, sir, this has just been a great time talking with you. Yeah, the subject matter hasn't been like, ooh rah, or, go Army, but it's certainly
Thanks for not
solidified.
bringing up the Army Navy game from a few weeks ago. I appreciate that.
I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to do it. I work with a naval commander. He's retired, and he was like a proud peacock the whole week. So
we've both been on the winning sides and the losing sides. So,
right, right. And I hope we get some more wins with this issue. So I just want to thank you for coming on and talking with me.
Anytime.
I'll close with this. It was a really cool moment. My second time on C-SPAN, when you called in and we got to chat on national TV like we're doing now.
That was awesome.
That was a really awesome moment. I want to thank you for that. Um, Dennis, if you need help, message me tonight. If that's what, so Dennis Donohue's saying Vet Center help me, or maybe Vet Center help me. I don't know, but if you need help, get a hold of me or somebody, and we will help you. Please, um, you know, I'm right there in the show. Do that, but um, I definitely want to have you involved for next year as we count down to number 500 in year 10. It's been stories and times like these that make doing Oscar Mike Radio worth it, sir. And certainly I appreciated getting to talk with you offline and other times. So appreciate you coming on tonight.
Anytime, Travis.
Well, there you have it, folks. Colonel Resnick has a wealth of experience. He shared it here tonight. It's been really great getting this kind of perspective during these trying times. And as long as we are there for each other, and as a leader, you can really set the tone for your people, whether you're in a civilian job or in the military or law enforcement. You can be the change right then and there. I'm Travis with Colonel Resnick. We're Oscar Mike Mission Flight. We'll see you next time. Thank you.